Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into some truly thought-provoking sources.
Hmm.
They offer a provocative new lens on a very recent historical event, the June 2025 airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. We're looking at articles like, when the courts block tariffs and deportations, bombs fly, the spite doctrine of Trump 47, and the spite war, when Trump couldn't deport, he bombed. These pieces suggest something, well, pretty intriguing, that the bombing wasn't just a straightforward strategic foreign policy move,
Hmm.
and maybe also a direct consequence of, domestic policy frustrations. So our mission for this deep dive is really to unpack this bold idea,
Yeah.
exploring the surprising connections our sources draw between internal policy battles and external military action. You're about to gain, hopefully, a fundamental shift in how you might view these kinds of global events.
What's truly striking here, I think, is how these sources really dare to challenge the conventional narrative.
Right.
They propose we look beyond a simple wag the dog explanation, pushing us to consider a much more intricate interplay of economics, law, presidential power.
Uh-huh.
It raises a fascinating question. Could domestic restraints on a president actually, redirect their focus to foreign arenas?
Yes.
And almost becoming a sort of pressure release valve.
Okay, so where does this intriguing theory actually begin? Our sources take us back to Trump's ambitious 2025 blueprint for America, which they provocatively label a strategy to make America rich again, not through foreign conquest, but, well, an inward focus.
Precisely, yeah. The sources describe a vision rooted in two key pillars: revenue-generating tariffs and what they termed big, beautiful, economy-stimulating deportations.
Wow.
Stepping back, the broader implication was to create a wartime economy minus the foreign battlefield. That's a powerful metaphor they use, right?
Yeah.
To convey the scale of envisioned spending without the typical military conflict side of things.
So the practical application of this, as our sources lay it out, was basically to tax imports heavily, detain undocumented individuals, and then just pour the proceeds
proceeds, yeah.
from both into this vast domestic infrastructure.
Exactly. The funds were slated for an expansive apparatus,
Mm-hmm.
new judges, additional lawyers, bus fleets, immigration and customs enforcement, IC contractors,
Right.
and a sprawling, privately managed logistics network just dedicated to detention and relocation. The sources even use these really striking metaphors like a new deal of detentions
Mm-hmm.
and a Marshall Plan of removals. Now, they're not endorsing the policy itself, obviously.
No.
But they use it to underscore the sheer economic logic,
Yeah.
the logic of initiating large-scale state spending. The aim was apparently to inject trillions into the economy without explicitly calling it a stimulus package.
Okay. But this ambitious domestic agenda, as our sources reveal, was about to hit a massive roadblock. They describe it as running headfirst into a wall of injunctions from the courts.
Yeah, and a particularly striking detail the sources highlight here is the contrast with previous administrations. While Barack Obama deported over 3 million people between 2009 and 2016, often through expedited removal, which is essentially a fast-track deportation process, right? Doesn't require a full hearing.
Right, faster.
Yeah, faster. There wasn't this, widespread procedural lawfare from federal judges back then.
So the judiciary seemed to, well, largely defer to executive discretion under Obama. Is that fair to say?
That's what the sources suggest, yeah.
But then, our sources point out, when Trump attempted to expand these very same expedited removals, the courts responded differently.
Right.
His policies were halted, not because they were ruled inherently unlawful, but because courts started demanding more due process.
And one of the key distinctions they draw here is how a single federal court ruled that even a migrant in the U.S. for less than 2 years had a right to contest removal in court.
Even less than 2 years.
Yeah, despite being, as the sources say, well within statutory limits for expedited removal. So due process, sources kind of suggest, became the judicial weapon.
Interesting.
We also learned that the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, this obscure, really old law,
1798.
that Trump apparently tried to use for fast-track removals of nationals from hostile states, that was also swiftly struck down by the courts.
Wow. So they tried to revive an 18th century law, and even that got shut down. That really underscores the depth of the judicial resistance, doesn't it?
It seems to, yeah.
Our sources illustrate that under Trump, the judiciary intervened to significantly slow or even halt these efforts to use expedited removal at scale. And this becomes a truly crucial point of contrast in their analysis. So, okay, If a president, especially one our sources describe as pugnacious and maybe keen on this large-scale spending, is blocked from using these domestic enforcement tools, what happens next? According to this theory, he looks abroad. Indeed. The June 2025 airstrike on Iranian nuclear facilities, specifically Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan, which was officially dubbed Operation Midnight Hammer.
Right.
It's presented as more than just strategically significant. It's deeply symbolic, they argue.
How so?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the sources suggest that in a world where Trump was, quote, reviled by NATO, scorned by the EU, and dismissed by most of the UN, Israel remained his last real state ally, which in their view meant your friends' enemies become your enemies by default, a kind of inherited conflict.
And the sources are very clear on this point. This wasn't about distracting from scandal or boosting approval ratings. His base support was already, quote, a monolith.
Right. Pretty solid.
So if it wasn't those typical reasons, what was the driving force, according to these articles?
This is where the core thesis of the sources really comes into sharp focus. They propose that Trump bombed Iran, in part because it was the only way left to spend federal dollars like a wartime president.
With tariffs blocked and these large-scale deportations sandbagged by that wall of injunctions, America, according to the sources, needed a new way to inject trillions into itself without calling it a stimulus.
And war fits the bill.
Well, they explain, war tends to be bipartisan, it's procedural, and crucially, it's immune to the injunctions that plague domestic enforcement.
Ah, okay. Immune to the courts, basically.
In this context, yeah. And it results in a predictable surge of funding for defense contractors, intelligence services, federal logistics, all that machinery.
Now, our sources don't just present this as a given. They dedicate an entire counter-argument review section to, understanding the nuances.
Which is important.
Exactly.
Right.
For instance, the claim that mass deportation can act as an economic stimulus is thoroughly examined and ultimately considered debatable.
Yeah, what truly stands out in that analysis is the acknowledgement that while, okay, a massive deportation effort would create jobs in enforcement, detention, legal processing.
Sure, you'd need people for that.
Right. But the long-term impact on industries, heavily reliant on undocumented labor, could be severely damaging. And they also emphasize the upfront costs would be enormous.
Right.
Just huge.
Right. Makes sense. And the ultimate provocative claim that Trump's bombing of Iran was primarily driven by this domestic frustration is clearly labeled interpretive by the sources.
Yeah, they're careful there.
They note that no official source admits this, but they argue the pattern of escalation aligns with political and judicial constraints on domestic initiatives, which makes it a compelling, if unconfirmed, theory.
Ultimately, what this offers you, the listener, is a powerful framework, a way of understanding how the mechanics of power might shift when those traditional domestic avenues are closed off. It invites you to consider how policy tools and presidential priorities can be rerouted almost by necessity, when one path is obstructed.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Our deep dive today, guided by these pretty sharp sources, offers a compelling, maybe controversial explanation for why military action might have been taken. It paints a picture of a president whose domestic economic vision was, well, stymied by legal roadblocks, leading to a search for alternative avenues of large-scale spending.
And this raises an important question for you to consider. How often do global events actually have roots in these unseen domestic battles?
Yeah.
And what does this tell us about the checks and balances within a government, especially when they clash with a president's core agenda? Could it potentially push action onto a completely different stage?
The sources explicitly state their purpose, too. It's not an endorsement of any policy, they say, but rather a mirror to how the mechanics of power work when the avenues of domestic control are closed.
A mirror. Interesting phrasing.
Yeah. They provocatively suggest that in June 2025, Trump didn't get to spend his way into economic recovery with buses and immigration judges, so he spent it with bombs. It's a stark conclusion. So consider this. In an age where we're just overloaded with information, understanding these multi-layered motivations behind major global events can completely change your perspective. How might this framework apply to other historical or current events you're observing? Where a leader's domestic frustrations could be quietly influencing their foreign policy choices.
Yeah, this really invites you to think critically about causality, doesn't it? And to always look for those, maybe, hidden levers of power. There's always more to learn, and understanding these diverse perspectives truly enriches your comprehension of the world around you.